welcome to another episode of What You Need to Know, a Canadian Polycast. I'm Alison Fair, a consultant here at Bluesky Strategy Group, and I, as always, have the pleasure of being joined by my colleagues, Cam Holstrom, Neil Brody, and Jeff Turner. Hello, everybody.
Good morning.
Hello.
So, a lot going on lately. It just seems like we are bombarded with bad news lately. I wanted to talk about what the effects of recent news have effect on government business. I want to start with you, Jeff. What does this do for government business, and what will this mean? I mean, they're coming back next week. What will it mean for what we're going to see play out in the House of Commons?
Yeah, it certainly seems to be coming from all sides, doesn't it? Certainly the developments in Ukraine are just concerning on a global scale, because we've kind of seen this movie before, and it doesn't go well unless some really strong action is taken. But as you said, Alison, I mean, we just went through the better part of a month of frankly, lawlessness in downtown Ottawa that deeply affected the people of Ottawa. And I only say that as these are two things that are a little bit peripheral to the government agenda. These are not climate change issues necessarily. These are not, functionary government issues. The occupation was about a lot of things, and most of them were pretty far out there. And the Ukraine situation, of course, Canada is a strong ally, has the largest Ukrainian population outside of Ukraine and Russia. And so we have a very strong interest in that, and have for many years, and have had a strong position since 2014. What I'm getting at, though, is so while those two issues have fairly limited interconnectivity with the federal government. So, obviously foreign affairs and defense and our security system is responding to the Ukraine situation. Our public safety and the leadership of the federal government were responding to the occupation. That really shouldn't have affected things in other departments, right? But what we did see actually over those 3 weeks in the Ottawa context was a general slowing of things in Ottawa. It was harder to get a hold of people. And that could be just because the government itself was feeling a little bit under siege, right? And that all of the senior attention, whether that was ministers, cabinet time, the prime minister, the people in the prime minister's office were resolutely focused on that issue, just inherently slows up the gears.
Right.
On the Ukraine side, just very quickly, I think the biggest impact there will be the continuing attention of the leadership to this issue, not least of which including the Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, who has, as we all know, a very strong Ukrainian background and connection, and has always been sort of the lead voice on these issues in the Liberal government, obviously backed up entirely by the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, and the Minister of Defense. And so she happens to have a couple of other important roles too, which is to be the Minister of Finance with the budget sometime in about a month from now, and as the Deputy Prime Minister, who takes on a lot of the responsibilities of this government in terms of both external stakeholders and policy files that are really important. Yeah. So I think her attention being diverted to Ukraine is right, but it will also have effects in terms of the bandwidth. The Minister of Finance does not have a lot of bandwidth to begin with, and this will certainly tax it.
Neil, you've been within chief of staff of several departments within government, and what does these type of actions domestically and internationally have on a government when it comes to their decisions of what's going to take place over the time that they're in the House of Commons? Does it divert or does it help? Explain.
Well, first off the top, Alison, to take a step back, I think all of us in Canada should realize how lucky we are to live in Canada.
That is true.
We aren't overtly threatened by any neighbors. We have a relatively good life. What it does to the government agenda, as Jeff said, and we've talked about this on previous podcasts, the government, the large G government, I could say the large G government, can handle 2, maybe 3 big issues at a time. And of course, when it's a gigantic issue like responding to a pandemic, there's really not much time for anything else. And so you'll see that roll out, as Jeff said, over the next 3 or 4 months. We're expecting a budget out anytime soon. It's the end of February as I look at my calendar, which is traditionally the budget time. Most governments try to get a budget out before the end of the government's fiscal year, which is March 31st. So in the next month, I would say the government wants to get a budget out. But there will be calls in the House of Commons for more action on Russian oligarchs, the heads of the Russian government. We heard in the speech from the throne not that long ago, Indigenous reconciliation, pandemic response, climate change, inequalities in domestic affairs. The government's going to have to drop some of those for the next 4 to 6 months and concentrate on other things. And it really would look good on this government if they rolled up their sleeves, got down to work, and took some serious action against Russia, Mr. Putin and his cronies in Russia, who have unprovoked rolled into a sovereign country and are in the process of taking it over as we speak.
Cam, what does all these issues here that we've talked about do to affect how the opposition is going to bring forth items within the House of Commons? Because as Neil said, there are things that the government wants to do that were outlined in the throne speech, and they just seem to be moving farther and farther away from getting done.
And that's what happens when, frankly, events happen and take over the agenda. And really can have one of two effects. It can either focus the opposition and bringing them back to certain topics, or it can bring people together. And we saw that at the beginning of the pandemic. It really focused the mind and action. Or it can have the opposite effect and tear apart and make things more difficult. Where I draw the connection between what happened in Ottawa, what's happening right now in Ukraine, is just the general health of the body politic right now and democracy around the world in general. It wasn't lost on me that a lot of the same voices that are now taking up for Vladimir Putin as they try to march on Kyiv are some of the same voices that were giving airtime to Randy Hillier on RT or pushing conspiracy theories about a dictator in Canada on Fox News. We have this ecosphere out there now that is openly malignant to actual democracy. And as a society, as democratic nations, we have not figured out how to deal with that yet. We just simply haven't. And that's naturally going to make it more difficult for any government to attempt to govern. It's just going to make it, you're dealing with more fracture. And the longer it goes on, the more stress there is, the more wear and tear it puts on that. And that's my big concern going forward. We're all watching what's playing out live on our televisions all across Ukraine and in a lot of horror. But at the same time, we know it needs to be done. We know the steps need to be taken, yet so far there hasn't been, obviously we don't want war, but I don't know if we've ever gotten our heads around the fact that it may have to come to that, even if we don't want it. Or at the very least, we've been taking slower steps in the measures we have, being concerned about triggering something that's already happening. So I guess my concern is that, if we move all of our sanctions against Vladimir Putin and his oligarchs and the Russian people and Belarus and the whole 9 yards, 2 weeks after the invasion of Ukraine is complete, what did it matter, right? There was a country aspiring to join the West, whether you feel it should be in NATO or not, but aspiring to those democratic values, who believed in the project that we're talking about, to the point where they're now fighting for it, where teenagers and elderly citizens alike are taking arms and building Molotov cocktails and throwing themselves at the highly trained Russian army for that very value, while we kind of sit back and we fight about if we should even have it. I think Vladimir Putin, frankly, doesn't give a darn. He's worried about protecting his own rear end. He doesn't want to see democracy happening on his doorstep.
Well,
I'm scared that he's showing more resolve right now than we are.
Yeah. Well, it's frightening to see what's happening over there by the ego of one man, for sure. Quickly, you all mentioned the budget. You think March will be when we see it, or as Doug Ford did in the Ontario legislature, possibly into April? Jeff, I'll start with you.
Last year, the budget was on April 27th, but that's because it was the first budget in 2 years. There was another wave that had just hit us right at the beginning of that budget. We know from our work, because we're fairly well connected, we know from our work that they had to pivot on a lot of pieces in order to address it sounds so quaint now, the third wave. And so that was material to that, both a double budget plus a pivot, 3 to 5 weeks before publishing time was probably the cause of that. I haven't heard any indications that it's going to be late this year. I would consider April late. point. And so March is definitely a good bet.
Neil, do you see a budget coming before the end of March?
For the public services sake, I certainly hope, because if it goes past March 31st, the public service kind of freaks out. There's a nice window leading up to the last week of March, which allows them to talk about the budget the first week of April, and then 2 break weeks to go discuss the budget. So yeah, the end of March is where what I think is going to happen.
And Cam, are we going to see a budget, as Neil and Jeff have said? Do you feel March is going to be the date?
I think that we're actually going to be looking at an April budget. I'm just looking at the calendar of the House of Commons. That the House only sits for a couple of weeks in March and a couple of weeks in April. I think what we're going to see is we're going to see a budget announced on the first week of April, to be followed by 2 open weeks of the House not sitting, so government ministers can fly around the country and tell us all about how amazing they are and their budget is, and why we should all get behind it. Just as they always do.
Just as they always do. And then on that note, I know we always tend to end on a positive note as much as we possibly can, so I will there. Our next podcast, obviously, based on all 3 of your recommendations, we'll be talking about the budget. So thank you, Neil, Jeff, and Cam. And thank you to the viewers for watching another What You Need to Know, a Canadian podcast. Have a great day.
Bluesky Strategy Group is one of Canada's leading public affairs firms. For government relations, lobbying, and strategic communications advice across Canada, visit us at blueskystrategygroup.com. Bluesky Strategy Group is a proud member of the Global Communications Alliance.